What is the phrase driver's license? If you had one, you would not need to sign the document. By form and function, what you have is a pledge card, when you obligated yourself to comply within the terms of a unilateral contract, also known as a performance contract. First, we have to examine what is known as the public right-of-way. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania started out as a common trust before it became a private corporation. When functioning as a trust, a contract was made to set aside land for public use, such as the roads, and no permits or licenses were required, since freemen didn't need permission to trespass on such designated property. Rather, words such as egress, regress, or migrate on land that they held a rightful claim. The public land was owned collectively. That was the contract. It was a shared space or common usage owned by the public and was to be guarded by the trustees. For example, if game was to be harvested from public lands for resale, at one time when trapping was popular, then a license was needed. Otherwise, if a man needed to feed his family, he had a natural right to hunt or fish on public lands to reap the dividends of the trust. The philosophy back then treated the air and water the same, for common use. Do you need a license or permit to breathe? To collect rainwater? Not yet. But then the trustees became corporate officers, abandoned their oath, forsaken common law, and devised means to commit theft under Roman civil procedures, otherwise known as corporate policy. It is my opinion that all corporate officers are agents of theft because the public lands were then treated as if the land was owned by the corporation. What is the brass ring? The secret to this type of theft. The goal is to have the public at large surrender their inherent liability without being the wiser. For without inherent liability, you can never exercise an inherent right, as if written on the genetic code, your natural rights as a human. You had a right to act and were responsible for your actions, held accountable under the general rule of harm no one in the process of pursuing one's life. A natural right is self-defense and other rights such as to travel. Now you have neither. There is a famous quote from what is known as the Declaration of Independence: the consent of the governed. The elected trustees, turned bureaucrats, then mutated themselves into corporate officers, found a weakness in the word consent and bastardized it so that the people would consent to waive their rights, done so by the allure of leisure, convenience, and security. To sidestep a moment, only a human performing in honor, conducting themselves responsibly, can possess inherent liability. Anyone under the age of accountability, the age of consent, usually 18 years of age, cannot exercise inherent liability. An honorable man would never flee the scene of an accident and would accept liability if in fault for injury or damage handled in a civil case if the claim was disputed. If dishonor was deliberate, such as an assault, that would be a criminal matter. In the corporate world, no one is to be trusted and all are declared dishonorable by default. You've heard the phrase, to break the law. To break the law is an act of dishonor, or if accused, that is when an honorable individual is tainted with dishonor. The phrase innocent until proven guilty actually meant one in honor until proven dishonorable. In circa 1903, the Commonwealth played a hand of poker and declared all roads a threat to public safety, thereby under the doctrine of necessity, the laws of war, and such emergencies, the contract in regards to the public right-of-way was suspended. The roads were declared hostile, plagued by dangerous vehicles operated by reckless motorists. No mention was made that the roads themselves were a danger, and had been for centuries. Traveling is a risk venture. Such a declaration of martial law can only be valid temporarily and could be challenged as unconstitutional if extended for a long period. To justify the roads being a threat to public safety, in circa 1903, all vehicles were pre-adjudicated dangerous and all motorists as reckless by default. Concerning motorists, they were declared dishonorable, those who were predetermined derelict in their inherent liability. It would be like the Commonwealth had said that all males, either Italians or Mexicans, for example, are wife-beaters or drug addicts. This form of pre-crime, not by making an individual determination on a case-by-case basis, but rather casting all into a single group, all guilty by association. When martial law was declared upon the roads in regards to the public right-of-way, both the vehicles and the motorists became contraband, not allowed to trespass without first being registered, licensed, and issued a tax stamp known as a license plate. The word tax only applies to contraband. If something is taxed, then that means it was declared contraband in some way, because the word contraband is the magic word, like a rubber stamp. It means to collect revenue. After all, a tax is a tool to commit legalized theft, taking something from you, your property, under the threat of violence, such as the portions of your earnings each week. Before whiskey or tobacco could be taxed, it first had to be declared contraband. After taxes are paid, the bottle of whiskey or pack of cigarettes became licensed and or legal contraband. Do you know that the Vehicle Code was originally designed for occupied territory? It is a rule book on how to collect revenue from things declared contraband, such as whiskey and tobacco, and even vehicles were cast into this definition. The Department of Revenue had specialty divisions to collect such revenue from each item marked contraband. Because of your ignorance, never being told about your inherent liability, your birthright, that such a thing even existed, when you made an application to receive a license asking permission to enter the default class of reckless motorists, without first challenging the pre-adjudication in court, you accepted the conditions, waiving your right of dispute, and then, by implied consent, pleaded guilty to the criminal charge of recklessness. The roads were placed in a perpetual condition of martial law, one application at a time. Yes, the phrase martial law was branded upon your copy of inherent liability by the act to make application. This was a slick move, for the dumb and stupid peasants placed themselves in bondage and waived their constitutional protections. Do you know that if there were 1 million motorists in Pennsylvania who held a driver's license, then there would be 1 million vehicle codes? The unique license identification number is your unilateral contract number. Unlike a union bilateral contract, when representatives on both sides sign on behalf of the affected parties. Remember that any right or benefit can be waived, knowingly or otherwise, often by implied consent. Any section of the Pennsylvania Constitution, especially sections 1 and 2, that protected your inherent rights, well, you agreed to waive them and agreed to exist by privileges. And you did so by surrendering your status as a human and became a person. That's why, now existing not as a human but as a person, you need a license or permit to have a firearm, to work on your house, and so on. The reason for this treachery is quite simple to comprehend. Inherent liability cannot be taxed nor regulated, but assigned liability allows the corporation to rake in kilos of that green leafy substance, cash, often to feed its own interests. Humans are seen as a crop to be harvested, a renewable resource, no different than livestock. Because of the fact that you snitched on yourself and pleaded guilty, the sentence was suspended. Now, as a confessed criminal, you had to forfeit inherent liability, thus by your own act relinquished your inherent right to travel. Then the Commonwealth assigned liability back to you under statutory regulations which granted you a privilege to trespass upon corporate property. By form and function, your driver's license is a parole card with your mugshot. After 1919, the word license is a blatant lie. If it were a license, your signature would not be needed to activate it. The only license you have in relation to the vehicle is the title, since it's signed by the Secretary of Transportation. That document, the title, was or is so powerful, no definition was ever promulgated to clarify its wide-range importance, and you were instructed to keep it out of sight, out of mind, tucked away in a safe place. The Commonwealth granted you a privilege to trespass upon the roads by the use of a unilateral contract. This so-called Vehicle Code is a guide regulating your conditions of release back upon the roads to legally trespass. By form and function, you are a parolee, and once paroled, that has a consequence of your privilege being revoked. After 1933, when an emergency was declared on the war powers, the government was no longer obligated to enter into contract with the enemy, and thus was not bound to issue licenses, only accepting an act of surrender by use of unilateral contract. As a motorist, you are what is called a belligerent. Liability, in this case assigned liability, is treated as a commodity, as a corporate asset. Besides the initial money generated selling this indulgence, rules are drafted and worded in such a way as to ensure substantial money can be collected through fines. As time went on, the rules became more and more arbitrary and vague to increase revenue. The point system was created to allow the insurance companies reason to raise your rates and then share it in the money pie. Take the charge of careless driving. It is without definition, so it's left to the limits of the police officer's imagination to decide what it is based on his prejudices. Get caught picking your nose for a second? Guilty. What makes matters even worse, careless driving is described as careless disregard, and that phrase is likewise not defined. Also, there is reckless driving and distracted driving. All these generic terms are selected to increase fines and penalties besides making things confusing. One stipulation when applying for a trespass license is that you, by implied consent, made the roads constitutional free zones or districts. The word district is a military word. If a citation is issued, you waived your right to have a trial by jury and agreed to have matters done administratively. Only in certain cases, like the DUI, are held by jury because it allows the boys in the judicial system to use the platform to gain notoriety and leverage for promotions and seeking elections by getting another notch on their briefcase. Can't forget about keeping the public amused and punishing the nasty bad man. When you reapply for a license renewal, you are pleading guilty again to have the conditions of parole extended for another 4 years. Did you ever think of filing a petition for declaratory judgment 60 days before your parole ended? The Commonwealth bit itself in the ass when it created the learner's permit and driving test. What takes place? You pass the test and then immediately apply for a license and or have the permit stamped. You waive the benefits of the test, of your ability not to need a license. Those who fail the test are the ones who need a license based on the original concept that all motorists are reckless by default. Originally, no test was needed. You had to sign an affidavit that you were at least 16 years of age, not feeble-minded, and had the physical strength to operate a vehicle. These legal requirements were needed to accept your guilty plea. We are all stupid fools. Passing the test is proof that you do not need a license, that you can function under inherent liability. If you cause an accident with injury or property damage or had a history of doing so, that could be used to validate a need for a license. If you have what is called a good driving record, that is evidence the license is not needed, that you do not need to be supervised as a parolee. Failure to appear in court for a traffic citation would be an act of dishonor and grounds that you would need a license. Managing the system like that is not cost-effective and cuts into the profit-loss ratios. Commonwealth found it to be a greater increase of revenue if all were reckless by default and treated as criminals. Many motorists do complain, and a varied amount of testimonials are uploaded on social media that when getting pulled over, they are in fact treated as criminals. An actual license signed by the grantor and authorized agents would be issued to someone who demonstrated a good driving record. Otherwise, those who are dishonorable would need to sign a parole card or the pledge card. The evolution of the license was devious and methodical. At first, the license was indeed a license signed by the senior authorized agent, the grantor. Then when the facsimile signature was used for the senior officer, it had to be attested by the local or subordinate agent's actual signature who issued the document. Then it became a requirement that the motorist had to countersign. Then to the point, as it is now, that it is a pure unilateral contract having the liable party sign, the motorist. To sidestep a moment, take littering for example. Statutory regulation was never needed under common law, the law of the land. If you discarded trash, then you committed an act of dishonor and would be held accountable. But as for littering, since the roads are governed by the law of the sea, by your consent of maritime admiralty law, transport and commerce, now under unilateral contract, as one deemed dishonorable, you signed an extra stipulation on your driver's license not to litter. Originally in Pennsylvania, 4 types of licenses were available, or actual licenses. On the commercial side, there was the paid driver and the chauffeur. For non-commercial purposes, there was the owner's license and the operator's license. You could apply for and receive all 4 at the same time. As mentioned, initially, a license was a license because it was signed by the tax agent. And with the tax agent's signature, it was a license certificate. At one time, commercial licenses were in the form of a badge worn on the cap, since if a paid driver was seated in the truck, bus, or taxi, their badge was visible. After 1919, the owner's license was repealed because after that date, owning a vehicle as private property was prohibited. The paid driver and operator was combined into one license format. The Commonwealth made the default setting a driver, one engaged in commerce, to ease burden upon the police officer, not having to conduct an investigation. However, since you are the one who endorsed the conditions of release, you get to stipulate how you are trespassing, either as one engaged in commerce or as a traveler, which is an operator. I'll mention surcharges in a moment. The definition for the operator, that's one who is traveling, is still found in the Vehicle Code, Section 102. It reads, operating privilege. The privilege to apply for and obtain a license to use, as well as the privilege to use the vehicle on a highway as authorized in this title, but not a contract, property right, or civil right. That is another example of deceptive generic terminology. The Commonwealth claims the privilege is not a contract, property right, or civil right. That is partially true. However, when you sign the driver's license, it's evidence of a unilateral contract under admiralty jurisdiction. When the word contract is used by itself, it implies a bilateral contract. If it is alleged that you breached the unilateral contract, a civil right is activated in a manner of due process provided. Also, what is the benefit of being liable? What elements are needed to make a privilege a privilege? If the privilege of operating is not at least a unilateral contract, void of a property right or civil right, then it doesn't exist and becomes a phantom. Take the word driver, as found in Section 102. It reads, a person who drives or is in actual physical control of a vehicle. What they are trying to hide is by saying a driver who is one who is a paid driver or an operator. That's an oxymoron. You can't be both under one term. Then we have to take a look at the definition for driver's license. It reads, a license or permit to drive a motor vehicle issued under this title. This is a major blunder because the federal government defines a motor vehicle as one used for commerce, and a federal definition supersedes the state's vague definition. Based on this information, you do not need a license to operate only if you're engaged in commerce under a unilateral contract. When getting pulled over by a police officer, you admit being a driver by not declaring otherwise. The subtle nuances of the game. After 1919, you were upgraded from reckless to a thief, and by 1933, you were upgraded again to an enemy of the United States corporation. Under the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, that was expanded in 1933 and reaffirmed in 1972, and is still in force today. The emergency war powers. You can invoke federal jurisdiction and outslick the slicksters. You may not have a civil right under the Commonwealth, but as an enemy of the United States, you have rights under federal law. The P in police stands for pillage and or piracy. For example, after being pulled over, if an officer asks for your driver's license and you do not declare your status, that being only a traveler operating a non-commercial vehicle, then the officer can assume you are engaged in commerce and attach surcharges to the citation. He has no affirmative duty to inform you there is a choice. He is there to maximize the amount of money he can grab out of your wallet. He can exploit your ignorance. A police officer is not a public servant. He is a corporate officer, and you are the servant to the new feudal corporate world order because you agreed by implied consent. Speaking of inherent liability, the easiest way for the government to have you surrender this birthright was to provide you with leisure and convenience, to have you raised as a dependent, marginally educated, and institutionalized, then treating you as an adolescent in wardship. Exercising inherent rights is too hard and too difficult. Who wants to grow their own food, or make their own clothes, or bake their own bread? We are junkies hooked on leisure and convenience. You live as farm animals, getting fed from the corporate handlers. A cow doesn't worry if the fence needs mending or if the barn needs a new coat of paint. The cow has leisure and convenience and will be harvested as payment. This deception in regards to inherent liability has been perfected centuries ago in Europe, known as the Roman Trust Agreement formula. It made the Vatican Corporation wealthy beyond belief, amassing billions of dollars in hard currency, in gold and silver. Using religious terminology, inherent liability was known as one's soul. According to the Roman theory, The soul was too precious to let you worry about it. So you agreed to let the bureaucrats, the priest, manage it for you as its trustee. Then they passed an edict making it mandatory that you surrendered your soul over to the Vatican Corporation. For all intent and purpose, you were placed on parole, having a shopping list of rules to follow and a lifetime of paying over 10% of your earnings. The Vatican doesn't tell you about inherent liability. They tell you about the original sin when your soul is to be placed in trust and held for ransom. If all are sinners, then all are dishonorable by default. Yet, if you have accepted the free gift that a Messiah came to provide a single one-and-done payment, then you become honorable. He came to liberate your inherent liability, your soul out of bondage, and no longer under the control of a corporation. The sheeple have lost the ability to ask questions, to ask the question why, lost the ability of critical thinking. Write a letter to Harrisburg and ask why you needed to apply for a license in the first place. Oh, for safety? That might sound logical, but where is that written? They will divert your attention away from the actual vehicle code and send you pamphlets in comic book format for you to read. And if you attempt to read the vehicle code at face value, it was published as a decoy to what was really going on. When you boil it all down, it's a scam contrived by a small group of humans to exploit all the rest of the humans. That you need to ask another human who is your equal for permission to live. That is why they are the ones well off and you are not so well off. If you needed a driver's license, the only one you need is called the insurance card. If you can't drive or operate a vehicle without insurance, then you don't need any other paperwork. There is too much redundancy for extra cash. Mandatory insurance made the mandatory driver's license moot. It's time to put away the video games and stop worrying about who will win the next football game. You let the system screw you over and even purchase the grease used. A vehicle after being registered can still be dangerous. A motorist after receiving a license can still be reckless. The idea of registration did not make the road safer. It only filled the pockets of the corporate officers. Take time to read the preamble of the Pennsylvania Constitution, a document that was written by those who were trying to protect humans from the European nobles, the executives of the corporation known back then as feudalism. For all intent and purpose, the preamble was the expletive-omitted "screw you" clause, written with the extended middle finger thrust into the face of all the agents of corporate fiction that raped Europe and had the peasants in bondage for centuries. It was a statement made to the king and to the other pious men who wear fancy costumes with titles of nobility, including their respective entourages, the bankers, merchants, lawyers, the priests, telling them to go and pound sand. Saying in effect that we don't need you nor want you. We claim a right to lay hands on ourselves and ordain a corporate free lifestyle without the need of the likes of you. If you're uncomfortable with the God word, then Mother Nature granted us the right, not needing to grovel at the feet of a corporation called Mother to pay for a license or privilege. But since childhood, you have embraced the corporatization of society and have known no other way of existence, existing as social inmates. You no longer consider yourself a man or a woman, a human, a member of the species. You call yourself a citizen, a person, an employee. All fancy synonyms for the word slave, otherwise known as a debtor, measuring success by a credit score and how much you are in debt. When all of this was taking place, the average motorist did not discover this treachery or even notice what was happening because there were too many distractions, such as a few wars and a major economic depression. Mixed in was seeking ever more and more doses of leisure and convenience. So, what is a driver's license? Before the Civil War, a slave needed a license to drive a team of mules or horses. A disclaimer: since the roads are a shared space, the need for rules is a no-brainer. Everyone has a desire to travel and come home each day, safe and sound.